I knew that I wanted my second novel to be set in the Dominican Republic, where I was born. Since I left there when I was 10 years old, it took me a while to go back. I started traveling back to the Dominican Republic regularly after college. And, once I started traveling back to the Dominican Republic, I found myself having experiences that I feel like weren't always available to like people in my family or people who are working class in the country. So it was interesting to think about the natural resources, the beauty of the island, and who gets to enjoy it. Just like you're saying, like I love Martha's Vineyard. I love, I've been to Nantucket. I've been to like these spaces that, like the Hamptons, are just absolutely gorgeous. And somewhere along the way, the last 20 years, the last 50 years, the last 100 years, they've become these kind of resting places and pleasure spots for the wealthy. And so I was really interested in thinking about a place like the Dominican Republic and thinking about these really insane resort. I mean, this is like $1 billion space, right? So it was very out of the ordinary. I've never stayed in a place like the one that I wrote about, but it was certainly inspired by my trips, all over the Caribbean, really, and seeing kind of that tension that lives between the people who work service and then the tourists that come to use, to use the islands as a playground. This time, I really did turn my attention to the combustible relationship between sisters. First of all, I think all relationships between family members are between human beings, I should say, tend to lean toward the combustible if you light a match. And so I was thinking a lot about these two sisters. I mean, Laura and Elena are both workers at the resort. Laura has really managed to get herself from very, very limited resources to become a manager at the resort, at the Grand Paloma Resort. And she's actually like the highest ranking local person who holds a position of leadership in the hotel staff. And so she's kind of running the hotel largely. Her sister is a babysitter and is only 17 years old. So I think it's important also to know they're 10 years apart. Laura is 27, and then Elena is 17. And yeah, I was really, really fascinated by the idea that if you take two people, like what we learned pretty quickly is that, these girls have had a very tough time in life. They lost their mom when they were children. Elena was only 4 years old, and, her older sister was 14. They have a father who is unreliable. And so Elena, being a child, really became kind of like a de facto daughter to her sister, Laura. I mean, Laura ended up really having to take a parent role for her sister. And so I really wanted to like think about the ways in which, again, two women who love each other fiercely, but who are quite at odds with like their relationship, both to their own communities, to their own countries, to their histories, and how that would manifest if I put them in like a 1 week kind of crazy week when all these things are kind of falling apart around them, and largely due to their decision making. I mean, the two of them are really the ones who are creating this spiral of terrible things that happen in the book. And then just to address your last point about, what made me want to write a book that was, largely in the suspense category. When I started writing this book, I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm gonna write a thriller. Like what I was thinking about a lot was, if I want to write a book about labor, which is, this book is really a work. It's in that genre of like, I would say it's like thematically concerned mostly with work and our relationship to work. Then how do I make a reader fall into step so that the relentlessness that we see with the protagonist, where they really largely don't stop working, that is mirrored in the reader's inability to put their book down. So if the reader's job is to read, then the reader then is unable to stop doing their job. So I was thinking a lot about like, how do I hook them? How do I make it so that they just have to keep turning the pages? So I was thinking a lot about Like, what are the things? What do we care about? I start the book right away. There's an injured child, and the injured child could really, it's a tourist white child, and it could like ruin the resort. It could ruin their chances to be successful. And so, I wanted the stakes to be really high, and then I didn't want the stakes to let up. So even as one thing gets resolved, another thing would rise, and and you would have the reader, care deeply about these employees in this resort. You would have insights into, a few of the guests as the employees are interacting with some of those guests. What ends up happening with Elena is that, we find Elena at the beginning of the book feeling quite dejected. She's someone who really believes in social justice. She thinks of herself as a revolutionary, as an activist, but has largely, grown up in a very sheltered environment because thanks to her sister, she really has grown up from the time that she was, 5, 6 years old in this resort. And so even though she is an employee of the resort, she's protected by her sister's authority. And she's also largely protected by this kind of like philosophy of life where she thinks, let's uplift the people, So she thinks a lot about, people who aren't being treated well. You have Haitians who are, being mass deported and who are suffering, just terrible treatment, not just on the resort, but on the island. And so, when we come to Elena, we find her feeling very defeated because everything she has been trying to do as she was nearing her graduation from this kind of global school that she has access to because of the hotel. She's been engaged in studying all these thoughts about human justice, and she just hasn't been able to enact any of it. So, she ends up making a pretty terrible decision early on in the book. She believes that she has, made a fatal mistake, but her sister knows that, in reality, things are not as bad as Elena thinks. But she's like, this sister of mine needs to learn a lesson. And so she decides to really exaggerate what has happened so that her sister can really get her act together. So what we end up witnessing over the next few days is Elena kind of spiraling, and one decision leading to a more terrible decision. I started out with like an overall plot of the 7 days. That's the way I sold the book because I hadn't finished writing the entire book when I sold it. What's so interesting for me is that I started writing the book during the pandemic. It was 2020, and I was writing them as short stories. And so in my own mind, I had, I would consider the book to have 4 central characters. It's the 2 sisters, and then we have Pablo and, Pablo's love interest, Vida. So I had those 4 as like the protagonists of the entire book. And I had pretty much said, well, this is what happens over 7 days. And, I sold that book with some of the samples were some of the short stories I had published. And when I sold the book in 2023, I had this idea that I would like have this book be a certain, 7 days was the idea. And like you would kind of see and follow some of the employees. When I started writing it, you know how it is. It's like you start writing it and then it goes kind of left. So some of the stories changed quite a bit. I ended up writing the 7 days for like those 4 characters. And then I like cut the parts to fit so that it would be like a relentless pace, so that you would be following one character and get to know them. And then, all along you understand the story belongs to the 2 sisters. Even when you're with Pablo or when you're with Vida, things really do revolve around those 2 sisters and the decisions they're making. But part of what I wanted to do was to really make it so that this overall question that happens, there's like a big question about the disappearance of some characters and whether or not those 2 characters are alive. And so, I decided pretty early on, like, yeah, it's like go big or go home. It's like, there's this kind of life or death situation that these 2 sisters are caught up in. And so I wanted, like, that was what I thought about. And as I was thinking and putting together and cutting some of the characters, some of their days don't make it at all into the book. And so that the pace, so that it would stay a shorter book and so that it could be more suspenseful. I mean, I think what's really interesting is that as a child, I remember there was one major storm when I was a child. And I remember like the night before the storm came, everybody kind of goes to the house that is the sturdiest. So it would be like the concrete house versus, some of our neighbors lived in tin houses or wooden houses, and those structures are not going to survive a tropical hurricane. And so yeah, I just remember being a kid and like this big storm came to our country, and I can tell you that the kids were having a blast because you pretty much have to cook all the food because there's no electricity and there's not going to be electricity for days. And so, while the parents are all worried and stressed out, the children are just eating and it's a party, and so I remember like this sense that I had when I was a child of like, oh my god, like we felt this kind of sense of like dread from the adults because they were so worried. But as children, we weren't worried. And of course, in the morning, what I remember, and when that hurricane came to the Dominican Republic, I think I was maybe like 3 or 4 years old. And it's like one of my most vivid, earliest memories was walking with my mom through the town, and like there was no town. It had been flattened. And so, when I turned my attention to thinking about writing a book that was happening in the Caribbean, it is now very, very much part of like Caribbean literature lore that like everyone that's writing a big book about the Caribbean has a hurricane. So I was like, well, my hurricane's going to be the biggest, baddest hurricane that ever happened in the Caribbean. But I also wanted to like really explore like two things that I think are interesting. The first one is this idea of power, because in this book, power is a really big theme, right? Like we see characters trying to get power, trying to get closer to privilege and wealth. And then you have other people who just have power, have privilege and wealth and take it for granted, or wield it in really kind of criminal ways. And I was thinking, what's powerful? Nature. Like we might all be over here playing our human dumb games, right? Succession, like trying to like just have the power, have the money. But actually, like what's really humbling is a storm like that, because when the storm comes, it's like an equalizer. And then I was thinking too about like these structures, like in these hotels. I happened to be in Turks and Caicos during a really big storm. My husband and I were there on vacation. And when I tell you that a lot of the scenes that I ended up writing about the big storm in the Grand Paloma Resort were really inspired by that, because that was, that happened in the last decade. And we were inside, and, that we were staying at a very nice hotel, and they brought us a box with like nice wine and like all this food, and we're seeing the workers kind of hustling to like secure furniture, and they themselves, you could tell they're like terribly worried about their families, but they can't leave, they have to work. And so for me, like that stayed with me all these years, like the idea that you're taking care of people who are here to vacation and your family might be at risk. And then, on just like a more human terms, like this idea that because of where we are as a planet, these storms are only gonna get more fierce and scary. And how are people gonna be affected by that? Especially when you think about poor working class people, those are the people that are the most vulnerable. I had a pretty good sense of the fact that I wanted the book to end in a hopeful place. So, Jake, I was thinking a lot about repair because, I think that, there's been this kind of way in which stories are told about working class and poor people, where I feel like working class and poor people are often shown to be like really morally correct. And like we see people who are struggling in their lives and having just terrible circumstances, very often make the correct choice, the moral choice. And I mean, just based on like what I've lived through and what I know, I think that people who are in these kind of circumstances don't always have the power to make the morally right choice, right? Because they're at the beck and call of other people. They have to do whatever they need to do to survive. And so that's what I wanted to do, really, was to show how difficult it is for people to make good choices. And then also you have like your own kind of trauma and like what you've lived through. So I wanted to give these two sisters kind of like that humanity, to be like, these girls are going to keep making mistakes. Some of these mistakes are unforgivable. And then I really wanted to think about like, how can I pull off so that readers believe it, that they could actually make have enough of, enough heart where like people around them love them and people around them. And not just kind of their community or people who have grown up with them, but also some of these guests who see them, once a year. They would be willing to take a chance on these two girls, and like they would be willing to think about whether or not they are deserving of repair. And so, I think about that a lot. Like, if people make mistakes, if we believe, right, that there's hope for people to become better than they are, and that what their circumstances have yielded, um, does it make sense then to create hope so that they can become better people, And so that's what I was thinking about as I was kind of charting it. I didn't know. I knew that's the feeling that I wanted the reader to be left with. I just didn't know how I would get there because they're so terrible for most of the book. I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I can pull it off.